Now let's get into the more complex case. As we noticed in the previous chapter, markets don't always have to be at equilibrium. Sometimes prices may be a little bit too high, sometimes prices might be a little bit too low. So what happens to consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus when those situations are going to arise? So here, just to start us off, once again, we are in equilibrium with a single intersection of supply and demand. We have an equilibrium price of $300. We have an equilibrium quantity of $20, and consumer surplus, area below the demand curve, above the price. The big triangle on top is consumer surplus. Area below the price, above the supply curve, that is the producer surplus, the triangle on the bottom. So everything is pretty normal, nothing new in this regard. But what happens in the marketplace if, suppose that prices increase to $400? Using a little bit of economic intuition, who do you think is going to win and who do you think is going to be losing when this scenario comes to fruition? If prices are $400, that tells us that prices are above the equilibrium price of $300. So who would like this situation? Would consumers like this situation, or would suppliers like these circumstances? And in this instance, suppliers, yeah, of course, they would like this situation a lot because before they were receiving only $300, but now they're receiving $400 for selling the same exact good. So they should be winning in this situation. On the other hand, consumers, they do not like this situation a lot. Before they were paying $300, but now they're paying $400. So here, when prices go above equilibrium, this is exactly where that surplus or excess supply emerges within the marketplace. And we do notice that, hey, consumers are probably going to be hurt and producers are going to win, which does lead us for some implications on consumer surplus and producer surplus. One thing that we should note is quantity demanded is going to fall here. So before, quantity demanded was equal to 20 units, but now it's only equal to 10 units. Prices are very high, so consumers are actually only demanding 10 of these units, even though the marketplace is supplying something a lot more than 20 units, something more than these 10 and 20 units that we see right here. So in this instance, we are sort of constrained by how many transactions are taking place within the economy. Because consumers are only demanding 10 of these units, only 10 of these units are being sold as well. So here, this is far below than the 20 units that we had in equilibrium. And using the same economic intuition that we had before, we can identify our new areas for consumer surplus and producer surplus. So with a price of $400, this is a new price that we're taking a look at. Remember the area for consumer surplus. It's the area above the price, below the demand curve. So we notice that this triangle right here, the smaller triangle, is going to be our new consumer surplus. And as we go ahead and turn our attention, yeah, this is exactly what it's going to be. Producer surplus, as we see on the other hand, is going to be a very big area now. So prices are high, firms, corporations, they like this scenario, so consumer surplus, producer surplus should inherently be higher as well. It's the area below the price, but above the supply curve, and it's going to be constrained by how many units we actually have selling or the transactions that we have within the economy. So only these 10 units. So essentially this area, this very ugly area that we see right here, is our new producer surplus. And as you can see right here, we can actually divide this into two different areas. We have a rectangle right here, and we also have a triangle on the bottom. So here we're going to introduce a few more areas of a few more shapes in order to find specific values right here. And essentially when we work with this chapter, right, in this particular chapter, these are the only two shapes that we're going to be working with. Triangles and rectangles or squares. Nothing really too fancy or complicated. So no rhombuses, no trapezoids, only rectangles and triangles. And then finally here, we're going to notice that a new area also emerges, which is this gray triangle that you see right here, which is some type of inefficiency known as our deadweight loss. Before, we were able to sell 20 units within the marketplace, but now when prices go above equilibrium, we're only able to sell 10 of these particular units. So remember, we're constrained by actually how many transactions take place within the economy. So this loss of how many units that we sold before in equilibrium to now in our current circumstances is inefficiency, and this inefficiency is known as our deadweight loss. And this deadweight loss is always going to be this gray triangle that you see in the middle of our analysis right here. So here we can go ahead and calculate all the areas for consumer surplus, producer surplus, deadweight loss, and total surplus, if I gave you a few extra numbers right here, and we'll go ahead and do that specific case when we do the huge example in the next lecture. But here we can immediately see how things have changed within our economy in terms of efficiency and welfare. When prices go above equilibrium, consumers lose out, so inherently consumer surplus should be lower. Producers are going to be winning, so when we calculate out producer surplus, this area, the specific value, should be much higher. And the reason why we lose out on total surplus when we add these two together, why total surplus should be lower in this instance, is because we have some type of inefficiency, which is this deadweight loss, and we can calculate this area out as well. So anytime we are pushed out of equilibrium, in this case when prices exceed equilibrium, we are always going to be inefficient, so total surplus is going to be lower than when we are in equilibrium, and this inefficiency is known as the deadweight loss. So deadweight loss is the loss of consumer surplus and producer surplus caused by the inefficiency of a market that is not operating at equilibrium. Essentially, we're always going to be having deadweight loss anytime we are not at that single intersection point between supply and demand. We are being inefficient. And suppose that we go ahead and turn our attention to the other side of the story. Suppose that prices are below equilibrium. So knowing this, knowing what happens when we're above equilibrium, we can easily apply it to when prices are below equilibrium. So suppose that we're working with a price of $200. In this scenario, who should be winning instead? It would be the consumers that are winning. So we should see a very big area for consumer surplus because consumers, they love low prices. And as we take a look, we only see that suppliers are only having a quantity supplied of 10 units. So once again, we're going to be constrained by how many units are, or how many transactions are taking place within the economy. So for consumer surplus, the consumer surplus is going to be much larger compared to equilibrium. It's going to be the area above the price, so above $200, below the demand curve, and we're going to be seeing it's going to be constrained by these 10 units. So here, this green ugly area, the rectangle and the triangle, our new consumer surplus is much larger. Producers, however, are going to lose out. Before, they were selling these goods for $300. Now they're only selling it for $200. So producer surplus, area above the supply curve, below the price. So here we see the producer surplus, the small triangle, is much less than before. And because we are not in equilibrium, we are still going to have deadweight loss, this inefficiency. Before we were selling 20 units, now we're only selling 10 units, so therefore we lose out on some efficiency, some welfare, and that is our deadweight loss that we're going to be able to calculate. So once again, in each of these scenarios, because we are not in equilibrium, one part of the marketplace is going to gain, other part of the market is going to lose, and we're always going to be inefficient because we have this deadweight loss. So use this intuition to take a look and sort of identify these areas first, and then we'll go ahead and give you the specific numbers in order to calculate out and compare consumer surplus, producer surplus, deadweight loss, and total surplus when we're in equilibrium versus when we're out in equilibrium. Here, we're just going to be building up the idea of what happens in each of these scenarios. And just to complete this thought, when prices are below equilibrium, of course, that's where we have excess demand. That's where we have the shortage of goods, as we sort of explained in the previous chapters, in the previous chapter. So we'll go ahead, do the big complex example that we have for this particular chapter in the next video.